In the outer rim of the Valora sector, tucked between two dying stars, a small planetary body orbited in quiet defiance of the chaos beyond. It had no cities, no power grids, no transport lanes, humming with galactic traffic. The locals didn't call it a planet, they called it Cradle Moon. It was a place few dared to visit, and even fewer were invited to. Yet here, in lush valleys carved by time and wind, the galaxy's deadliest predators sent their young to be raised, not by their own kind, not by cold logic of machines, but strangely, deliberately by humans. Across the plains, the habitat domes shimmered under twin suns. Biodome structures blended seamlessly with the surrounding terrain, meadows, dotted with stone-barked trees. Hills that pulsed with fluorescent moss at night, and rivers that shimmered with blue mist at dawn. Inside those domes, cubs of various species played under artificial clouds, monitored by a very peculiar staff. Humans one stood in the tall grass, now tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in light exofabric. His nameplate read Reed, though the younglings couldn't pronounce it. They called him Rur, or Ree, or simply grunted in his direction with affection. He responded with patience, a whistle or a snack pulled from his vest. 5 feet from him, a juvenile ember beast was busy trying to melt a tree. It failed, miserably. "Try again tomorrow," Reed said, tossing it a cooling stone to suck on. The beast huffed, steam rising from its nostrils in defeat. It sat, like a child. He turned away, scanning the horizon where another dome shimmered into focus. Inside, a group of razor-claw cubs wrestled in a pit of sand and silicon powder designed to dull their claws just enough to prevent disembowelment. Reed tapped his cum. "Unit 12, keep an eye on Sandpit. B1 of the claws is getting bold again." "Copy," came the reply. Another human voice. Calm, familiar, to anyone watching from afar, the scene would be baffling. Why were the fiercest apex species in the known galaxy, some of whom had fought wars over territorial boundaries, some who had never signed a peace treaty with anyone, allowing their offspring to be raised by a species without fangs, scales, or venom? Humans. Squishy, thin-skinned, prone to emotional outbursts. And yet, trusted, not merely tolerated, not just permitted. Trusted. The kind of trust that came not from treaties or technology, but from a deeper, older thing. No alien council ever passed. Allah put humans here. No predator race ever voted on it. They just did. And for the newest arrival to Cradle Moon, that mystery was impossible to ignore. A young human newly transferred from Earth's Lunar Academy stood beside the shuttle dock, watching it all in silence. The domes, the predators, the humans walking among them like unbothered zookeepers in a pen of dragons. They turned to their escort and asked, "Why are we here? I mean, why are we the ones they let raise their young?" The escort didn't answer right away. They simply smiled, tired. Knowing Ann pointed toward a mountain ridge in the distance where a group of Nightfang cubs were curled beside a human technician, sleeping in a pile like pups around a fire. "Keep watching," the escort said. "You'll understand soon enough." Asterisk, the intern's name was Micah. Not that the name mattered much out here on Cradle Moon. People earned their identity not from what they were called, but how the predators treated them. Micah had only arrived 3 hours earlier, and already their mind was spinning with questions. The shuttle had barely cooled on its landing struts before Micah was guided past open enclosures of alien cubs. Every creature they'd read about in xenobiology texts was here living, breathing, playing. If not for the silent tension hanging in the air, it could have been mistaken for a galactic petting zoo. But this was no zoo. And these were not animals. These were the children of species whose adult members had once vaporized cities, dismembered armored marines, and cracked battleships open like ripe fruit. The Razor Claws, infamous for their duel-based culture, whose honor code prohibited the use of ranged weapons, Nightfangs, stealth predators, whose homeworld was a biosphere of eternal dusk, the Ember Beasts, whose internal temperatures could incinerate steel if angered. Their cubs were here, unarmed, unwarmed. Except for the humans. Micah kept walking beside their escort. A man named Gray, his boots left quiet imprints in the soft moss paths that weaved between domes. His pace was unhurried, like he had walked this path 1,000 times before. His exovest bore claw marks, old ones, long healed into the fabric. Micah broke the silence. "Okay. I have to ask." Gray said nothing. His eyes stayed forward. Micah gestured toward a dome where 2 ember beast cubs were fighting over a glowing fruit. A human handler knelt between them, holding out a 3rd fruit like a peace offering. The cubs took it. No growling. No resistance. "Why us?" Micah pressed. "Why do they trust us?" Gray finally stopped walking. He looked at Micah for a long moment, then turned to the left, pointing toward a nearby field. "See that?" He said. A group of Nightfang cubs were napping in a circle. At their center, a human lay flat on their back, hands behind their head. Peacefully asleep, surrounded by creatures with teeth designed to tear armor. "They like the sound of our breathing," Gray said. Micah blinked. "What?" "They say it's calm, predictable, that it reminds them of safety." Micah frowned. "But they're predators. They don't need comfort. They need dominance, hierarchy, strength." "You're thinking like a human," Gray interrupted. "You're thinking like we think they think. But they're not humans, and they're not monsters. They're parents." He paused. "And parents, whether they have fur, feathers, scaled spines, they all want the same thing. Someone who will protect their young without asking why." Micah looked away, down at their boots, then back up toward the handler inside the dome. The human now sat with the ember beast cubs curled against their side. One was snoring. The glowing fruit had been forgotten. "They don't even speak the same language," Micah whispered. "They don't have to," Gray replied. "Cubs know who's safe, just like predators know who's dangerous." That last sentence hung in the air like smoke. Micah's mind reeled. It wasn't just that humans weren't afraid of these young predators. It was that humans instinctively, consciously placed themselves between danger and the vulnerable. Even when the vulnerable had claws. Even when the danger was them. Micah opened their mouth to ask more, but Gray raised a hand. "You'll see soon," he said again. "Just stay alert. Cradle Moon teaches faster than textbooks." He turned and began walking again, boots brushing through violet grass. Micah followed. A dozen more questions buried under one that now echoed in their thoughts. What do they see in us? Not technology, not power, something deeper. Asterisk, the day began with calm. Twin suns filtered through a gauze of skyglass, scattering amber light across the domes of Cradle Moon. It was feeding hour in Sector B, always the most delicate time. Predator. Cubs, despite their age, carried instincts that pulsed just beneath their soft hides. Feeding time made that instinct surface. Some fought over food, others hoarded it like it might vanish. Some tested boundaries. Micah stood behind the viewing panel of Habitat Dome 7, arms folded, observing. Inside the enclosure, 2 razor-claw cubs circled each other near a nutrient mound. Their scales shimmered faintly, echoing the early signs of a territorial display. A handler, Lina, was already inside with them, walking with slow, deliberate movements, keeping her body turned toward both at all times. "Shouldn't we intervene?" Micah asked. Gray stood beside them, sipping from a hydration tube. "It's not unless there's blood," he replied casually. Micah stared at him. "I'm joking," Gray added. "Mostly, Lina knows how to handle them." "She raised that one," he nodded toward the more aggressive cub from the egg. Inside, Lina let out a sharp whistle. The cubs froze. She held up a piece of salted synth meat, split it in 2, and tossed one to each. The razor claws snapped their heads toward the meat, hissed once at each other, began eating. Crisis averted. Micah exhaled. "How did they even train for this?" "They don't," Gray said. "You either have it, or you get bit once and leave." Before Micah could respond, a shrill tone pierced the calm. Not from the dome. From the security alert panel on the wall. Red lights began to strobe. perimeter breach. Gray was already moving, tapping his wrist link. Control report. Source of intrusion? The voice on the other end came clipped, tense. Unregistered drone. Looks civilian-grade scanning for biological samples. It slipped past the outer nets, dropped low. It's in Zone C, Gray cursed under his breath. Zone C is the open range. The Cubs are outside. He sprinted. Micah followed. They passed handlers now moving to alert status, some strapping on light armor. Others activating perimeter shielding. Through the hall's curved windows, Micah could see the drone's silver speck cutting across the far side of the habitat, weaving like a predatory insect. It wasn't military, but it was fast, and it was hunting. They reached Zone C in under a minute. The open range was a vast field of tall grass and rocky outcroppings, designed to mimic a wild training ground. It was supposed to be supervised. Today, one cub had slipped away from the others, a night fang, smaller than most. It stood frozen. Near a stream, ears twitching. It had heard the drone before it saw it, so had the handler nearby. Micah hadn't met him yet, only seen him from a distance. But now, they watched as he ran straight toward the cub without hesitation. The drone veered. It had locked onto the night fang, either mistaking it for prey or targeting it deliberately. Micah saw it before Gray did. Asterisk. It's going to fire a sample dart, Micah gasped. That'll puncture its hide. Reed didn't stop. He reached the cub just as the drone descended. A burst of air fired, the dart shot forward, and Reed turned his body, shielding the night fang with his own. The dart struck him high in the back. He stumbled, arms still wrapped around the cub, and fell into the grass. Chaos erupted. Gray shouted orders. Two other handlers sprinted across the range, one pulling a sonic deterrent from their belt and aiming at the drone. A high-pitched frequency emitted, sending the drone spiraling out of control before it crashed into a nearby ridge with a dull explosion. Micah ran forward, breath ragged, and reached the spot where Reed lay. Blood pooled beneath him. The night fang cub was uninjured, pressed tightly to his chest. Trembling but alive, Reed coughed once, eyes fluttering open. Micah knelt beside him. Why would you? Reed's voice was quiet but firm. "'Cause it was a child." And then he lost consciousness. That evening, silence blanketed Cradle Moon like fog. The Cubs in Zone C had been evacuated. The humans were on alert, their normally calm routines disrupted by emergency protocols. Security patrols scanned the perimeter, and tech teams dismantled the drone's remains. Inside the observation dome, the Night Fang cub hadn't left Reed's side. Not once. Not even when medics had tried to remove it. Gray watched through the glass wall, arms crossed. Micah stood beside him. He could have died. Gray didn't answer at first. He didn't flinch, Micah added. Didn't even pause. "That's why we're here," Gray said quietly. Micah frowned. "To be shields. To be reminders," Gray replied, "of what real strength looks like." Outside, the Night Fang cub let out a soft echoing sound, a whimper. Almost like grief. Almost like loyalty. Micah didn't speak again that night, because they were starting to understand. Asterisk. The medbay on Cradle Moon wasn't made for moments like this. It was built for heat exhaustion, allergic flare-ups, and the occasional broken rib during training exercises, not for emergency trauma surgery caused by illegal drone weaponry. And yet, here Reed lay, motionless beneath a filtered healing mesh. His breathing shallow but steady. The dart had pierced beneath his shoulder blade, narrowly missing his spine. It was tipped with a biosample extractor designed to drill through. Even xenohide and pulled tissue strands for black market collectors. Had it struck the Night Fang cub, the outcome would have been fatal. Instead, it struck a human. And now, everyone was watching. The Night Fang cub hadn't left the recovery ward for 3 days. It had remained curled beside Reed's bedside, resting its furred body along the cot's edge. Its dark, shimmer-sheened hide reflected the soft glow of the biolights above. Occasionally it lifted its snout and sniffed the filtered air, checking on the human status. When the machines beeped or changed rhythm, it would emit a soft growl knot, one of aggression. But anxiety. No one tried to remove it anymore. Micah stood on the other side of the observation window. Arms folded tightly. They hadn't slept much. Since the attack, something inside them had shifted a weightless, floating realization that what they thought this station was, and what it actually meant, were galaxies apart. "Has anyone told its matriarch?" Micah asked Gray, standing beside them as always, nodded slowly. "She's en route." "And what happens when she sees her cub like this? With a human?" Gray didn't answer. Instead, he motioned toward a small hollow panel in the corner. "Check the archive," he said. Micah blinked. "What? You asked why they trust us?" Gray said. "I could give you answers, but they're better seen." He tapped the console. The screen flickered. The first recording loaded. 13 cycles ago. A massive ember beast cub. Twice the size of a grown man, pinned beneath rubble after a shelter collapse. Fires raging. Plasma alarms screaming. Human uniforms scorched, lungs likely damaged digging through the wreckage. He emerges with the cub in his arms, limping towards safety as the structure falls behind him. No hesitation. No pause. Next clip. 9 cycles ago. A razor claw hatchling caught in a flash freeze after a generator malfunction. A handler wraps it in there. Own thermal gear, kneeling in the snow, holding it against their chest, frost creeping up their faceplate. The razor claw survives. The handler dud. Clip after clip. A human shielding a night fang from a rogue climate drone. A human wrestling an ember beast cub out of a swollen river. Human standing between a frightened juvenile and its own panicked parent. Some humans lived. Some didn't, but all of them made the same decision. Micah's hands curled into fists as the final clip ended. The room felt colder. He turned to Gray. "Why don't they talk about this? Why isn't it part of the training?" Gray's face was unreadable. "'Cause if we taught it," he said, "you might hesitate. This work isn't about bravery. It's about instinct. The right kind." Micah turned back to the window. The Night Fang cub had moved again, this time climbing carefully up onto Reed's cat, pressing its body gently against his side. Reed's vitals held steady. Suddenly, the room's lights dimmed. Outside, a shuttle descended onto the landing pad. In absolute silence, the air shimmered around it as the vessel's heat dampeners activated. She had arrived. The Night Fang matriarch. Micah had only seen images. Before grainy surveillance photos taken during peace summits, ceremonial footage. From ritual hunts, up close, she was a presence that pressed down on the senses. Taller than a mech suit, eyes like twin eclipses, muscles rippling under fur, dark as void. Every human in the building stood still as she entered. She made no growl, no declaration. Approached the glass and looked inside. The cub sensed her presence immediately. It rose from Reed's side and padded to the glass, pressing its snout against the barrier. The matriarch lowered her head. They touched one on each side of the transparent divide. A moment passed. Then, without ceremony, she turned her gaze. To Reed, her stare lingered, deep, measured, not hostile, just thoughtful. After several long seconds, she tapped once against the glass with a claw longer than Micah's forearm, a signal, then she left. No words, no ritual, just a single, deliberate acknowledgement. Micah didn't speak for a long time, but in their mind, a quiet answer began to take shape. Not one given in speech or in orders, but in centuries of earned trust. Humans didn't protect because they had to. They protected because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. And the galaxy had noticed asterisk the next morning.
Yes.
A soft mist hung over Cradle Moon. It gave the air a silver hue, a dreamlike quiet that felt at odds with the storm of thoughts brewing in Micah's head. They hadn't slept again. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw that moment Reed's body covering the cub, the dart embedding in his back, the silence that followed. Reed was recovering, slowly. He was breathing on his own now, and occasionally muttering half-conscious words. The medic said he'd make it. The Nightfang cub still slept beside him, like a shadow that refused to detach. Micah couldn't stop thinking about it. Not just the moment, but the question that came before it. Why humans? Why trust humans with what every other species guarded more than territory, currency, or honor their young? And Gray, as always, gave no direct answer, only riddles, only a calm, knowing look that said, "Go find out yourself." That's what brought Micah to the lower archiver part of the station most interns never visited. There were no real doors here, just pressure-hardened panels and softly humming floor pads. The air was cooler, the lights dimmer. The consoles here didn't flash with holoscreens or chat interfaces. They hummed with quiet memory. Micah stepped up to the central node and placed a palm on the ID pad. The system read their print, then lit with a golden pulse. Access granted. Staff Archive Cradle Moon Tier 2A menu bloomed into the air, translucent and wide. It listed incident logs, non-public reports, behavioral studies, cross-species interaction, analytics, and then a file group labeled simply Observed Response Protocols, Species. Homo sapiens. Micah opened it. No narration, no analysis. Just video. The first clip started slow. Shallow marshland habitat. Rain fell in sheets across muddy terrain. Small ember beast cub had wandered too far from its group and slipped into a sinkhole, legs stuck, body sinking. It screamed, the pitch. Short and terrified. Within seconds, a human handler sprinted into frame, ignoring protocol, diving into the mud. They grabbed the cub under its arms, heaved it upward, pushed it to stable ground. They did not escape the sinkhole. The cub stood over the edge, looking down as other handlers arrived too late to pull the human out alive. No one said a word. The cub stayed by that spot for 6 days, refusing to eat. The next file was on a snowy ridge high-altitude simulation for razor claw terrain training. A sudden storm swept in faster than predicted. Visibility vanished. A handler used their own exosuit, 2 cocoon, 2 cubs into a heat shell, curling around them, whispering calming sounds. The wind took them all, but when found later, the handler had perished from exposure. The cubs were warm, untouched, file after file. Incident after incident, humans throwing themselves into danger not because it was asked or ordered, but because the child, regardless of species, was in danger. There was one with a Nightfang adolescent, teeth fully grown, undergoing its first hunting simulation. The adrenaline spiked too high, panicked, turned on its own kind. A handler stepped into its path and placed a hand on its chest. No weapon, no shield, just a voice. "I'm here. I've got you." The Nightfang froze, shaking, breathing hard, then collapsed into the handler's arms. Mika's throat tightened. They sat down, not realizing they were losing strength in their legs. They watched more. A razor-claw cub fell into a containment vent during an earthquake. A human crawled through 2 meters of sharp conduit to pull it free. Came out with lacerations on nearly every limb. A handler broke their arm catching an ember beast cub knocked from a cliff by accident. Another intervened between a young carnivore and an electrical arc flare that would have ended its life in a second. There was no glory, no celebration, just quiet logs, filed, dated, untouched. Micah leaned back and whispered, "They never tell anyone." The voice behind them made them jump. No one would believe it anyway. Gray stood in the archway, arms crossed, watching. Micah didn't turn around. "There's so many. Why aren't these? Why aren't these shared with the Union? With the other species? Why don't we use this in diplomacy?" Gray stepped forward and looked at the same file tree. Because predators don't trust words or policies or treaties. They trust patterns, memory, repetition. Micah frowned. "So, they just noticed. They remembered," Gray said. "They remembered the first time a human died saving one of their cubs, then the second, then the third. Then it stopped being a surprise. Then it became expected. It became respected." Micah stared at the footage still playing. Another handler lifting a whimpering cub from a frozen lake. Blue-skinned from hypothermia, but smiling the whole time. So we didn't earn their trust, Mika said. We gave it first. Without asking, Gray nodded. That's the thing. They fear the most about us. We protect before we understand, before we even know if something's dangerous, before we know if it's worth it. Micah sat there in silence for a long time. Gray didn't interrupt. Because this moment, the one where it all clicked, could never be taught. It had to be remembered, like everything else on Cradle Moon, like everything else humans had ever done. When no one was watching, Asterisk the Night Fang matriarch returned on the 5th day. This time, there was no shuttle escort, no visible escort at all. One moment, the horizon beyond Cradle Moon's ridge was empty. The next, a shadow moved through the sky, too quiet to be a ship, too fluid to be a creature. The air pressure changed across the station just slightly, the kind of subtle environmental shift predators carried with them. Wherever they went, she emerged from the tree line just after the second sun dipped behind the jagged cliffs. Her fur shimmered in twilight hues, shifting between deep violet and smoky gray. The guards at the gate didn't stop her. They didn't even speak. They merely stepped aside, understanding instinctively that this wasn't a formal visit. This was something older, something deeply personal. Micah was in the observation room again, but they weren't alone. This time, the room was packed with handlers, technicians, and even off-duty medics. All quiet, all watching. There was no protocol for this. No briefing. Just a collective understanding that something important was about to happen. Cub had not left Reed's side. Even now, it lay curled beneath the human's arm as if trying to absorb warmth through sheer will. Reed, still pale and weak, stirred occasionally, but had not yet woken. The matriarch entered the med bay silently. She moved not like a creature of flesh and bone, but like a living storm wrapped in velvet. Her eyes locked onto her cub immediately. There was no growl of recognition, no howl of reunion. She simply observed for a long moment the way predators do by looking, not reacting. Then she turned her attention to Reed. She approached his bedside. Her snout hovered just inches from his face. No sound. No gesture. Just that steady, predatory breath, fogging the sterile air between them. A claw, long enough to slice through most exosuits, lifted slowly and hovered over his chest. The room outside tensed. Several handlers instinctively reached for their emergency cuffs or stunners. Micah did not move. The claw tapped once on the edge of the bed frame. Then again, then it lowered. Gently. Carefully. She touched the sheet over. Reed's shoulder with the back of her paw, a whisper of contact. Nothing more. And then she did something no one had ever seen before. She lay down, right there on the floor beside his cot. Folding her massive frame into a resting posture, tail coiled beside her. She placed her head against the cold tile and breathed. It wasn't deference. It wasn't mimicry. It was grief, acceptance, vigil. Micah stared in stunned silence. This wasn't instinct. It wasn't ceremony. It was something far more dangerous. It was respect, not earned through power, not given through diplomacy, but born of something the Union could never legislate and no war could destroy. Memory, this. Wasn't the first time. It wasn't the second. There had been dozens, hundreds of times across colonies and worlds and border conflicts. Predators had learned over and over that humans protect young, not just their own, but any child. Calculation, without hesitation. Without regard for risk or reward, and something in the apex bloodlines of these creatures had taken note. Because respect among predators is rarely spoken. It is observed. Etched into shared experience, passed through behavior and story and instinct. The Razorclaws remembered a human that died protecting a wounded hatchling during a supply raid. The Ember Beasts recalled a handler who walked through a wildfire to carry a blind. Cub to safety, and the Night Fangs, silent and secretive, remembered. Reed, who stood between a drone and a child with nothing but his back. Predators don't praise. They don't hug. They don't thank. But they never forget. Micah sat down slowly, the weight of it all finally pressing into their chests like gravity remembered. They understood now why there were no plaques, no medals, no ceremony, because none of it had ever been about recognition. The humans here didn't protect the young for status or points in a Galactic Alliance database. They did it because somewhere deep in their evolutionary marrow, they had to. Because when the smallest voice cried out in fear, the first to respond would always be a human. Gray stood behind Micah now. He didn't say anything. He didn't. Micah turned slightly. It's not just that we're trusted, they said quietly. It's that we're known. Gray nodded. That's the difference. The room stayed silent for a long time. Eventually the matriarch stood again. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. She simply turned and walked away, her cub trailing behind her like a shadow reborn. Micah watched them disappear through the med bay door, and finally understood what Cradle Moon really was. It wasn't a research outpost. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a living memory. Written in instinct, reinforced through sacrifice. It was the place where the galaxy had decided, over and over, that the soft-skinned species with no claws, no armor, and no venom be the guardians of its future, not because of what humans were, but because of what they chose to be, again and again and again. 3 weeks passed before Reed could walk again. He did so stubbornly against every recommendation from the medical team. The wound was healing well accelerated by bioregenerative therapy, but the stiffness in his back and the occasional spark of nerve pain reminded him that some scars stay longer than flesh allows. Micah was there when he stepped outside the at Dash Bay. The air felt different that morning, cleaner, cooler. The season had shifted on Cradle Moon, the amber grass along. The outer enclosures now carried a soft frost that crunched faintly under boots. Even the sky seemed more vivid, painted with pale streaks of planetary rings. Glowing faintly behind drifting mist, Reed moved with a limp, his steps slow but determined. I stopped just outside the threshold of the dome, taking a long breath of open air. Micah stood nearby, uncertain whether to speak. It wasn't easy, watching someone you'd seen nearly die. It's alive, again alive, and calm, and already ready to go back to work like nothing had happened. But Reed noticed them, of course. He gave a nod, then squinted toward the distant fields. "They're out early today," he said. Micah followed his gaze. A group of cubs Nightfang, Razorclaw, and one particularly rowdy Amberbeast were playing beneath the morning light, chasing each other, leaping through cold fog, making noises that ranged from adorable to mildly terrifying. And at the center of it all, the Nightfang cub that Reed had saved. It wasn't playing. It was watching. Not the others, but Reed, as if checking that the human had returned. As if verifying a story that had grown too large to believe. Reed let out a quiet exhale. Good, he remembers. Micah finally spoke. So did the others. Reed looked sideways. Micah continued. The handlers, the staff, even the predators. They know. I saw the files, the archive logs, the footage no one talks about. Reed's expression didn't change. Micah took a breath. You know they watch us, right? The predators? They don't just drop off their cubs and leave. They're studying, recording, passing it through generations like we used to pass down myths. But instead of fire and thunder gods, they're telling stories about us. Reed didn't laugh. He simply said, Good. Silence lingered between them for a moment, until Reed finally began walking again, slowly toward the edge of the training field. Micah followed. The cubs saw them coming. Most didn't react, still too young to associate humans with anything but warmth and snacks. But the Nightfang cub stopped completely. It didn't run. It didn't growl. It lowered its head just a little and stepped forward. Micah froze, watching as Reed knelt slowly to one knee, wincing as he shifted weight to his injured side. The cub approached, cautious, and then without warning nudged its head softly into Reed's chest. Reed chuckled once, deep in his throat. You'll be trouble one day, he murmured. You're already thinking too much. Micah wanted to capture the moment, not with a camera or a datapad, just in memory. Exactly as it was, when they returned to their room that evening, they opened their station log for the first time in weeks. Not the mandatory reports, not the checklists. Their real log, the one they hadn't known they'd been writing all along. They began to type. Entry, Cycle 81, Cradle Moon. I've learned something they don't teach in xenopsychology. It's classes back on Earth. Something they don't say in recruitment pamphlets or flash in bold letters on union holoscreens. They say we're here because we're adaptable, that we're good with younglings, emotionally intelligent, resourceful, that we follow protocol and understand alien development better than any AI. But that's not why they send their cubs. To us, they send them to us because they've seen what we do when no one's watching. Because they've watched humans dive into danger without being told, break bones to save children they can't even speak to, die to preserve the life of a creature they just met. They trust us not because we're strong, not because we're smart, but because at our best, we are fearless in the face of innocence. Because when something small cries out, humans move, not out of obligation, out of instinct. Micah paused, staring at the blinking cursor, then continued. Today I watched a Nightfang matriarch bow her head to a human. No ceremony, no words, just a gesture, and that was more powerful than any medal. We used to say that predators ruled the stars, that they were the apex. But out here, I think they're letting us raise their future because deep down they know something we've forgotten. That kindness, when it costs you something, is the rarest kind of strength. When it comes to protecting what matters, maybe we're not the weakest species after all. Maybe we're the most dangerous. Because we remember what it means to protect without needing to be asked. Micah closed the file, saved it, stared out the window as the second sun set behind the Cradle Moon Mountains, casting long shadows over the domes below. Tomorrow, the cubs would play again, and the humans would be there watching, guiding, protecting, not because they had to, but because they always would.